The shelter staff didn't bother giving him a name. They just called him Cell 42. 100 pounds of jagged scars, blown-out nerves and teeth, waiting for the needle. He was the dog everyone warned you about. But Officer Dean Hatcher didn't see a monster. He saw a mirror. The department shrink told Dean he needed an anchor, something to tether him to the waking world when the phantom ringing in his ears got too loud. Get a hobby, Dean. Build a birdhouse. Adopt a dog. The shrink had smiled when he said it, a tight, practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. Dean didn't want to build a birdhouse. He didn't want to talk about the warehouse raid, the suspects in the dark, or the hollow sound a radio makes when dispatch stops calling your partner's badge number. So, on a Tuesday morning entirely devoid of sunlight, Dean drove his bruised pickup to the county animal control facility. It was a low, cinder-block building sitting on the edge of the industrial district, surrounded by cracked asphalt and chain-link fencing. The air inside smelled of industrial bleach, wet fur, and the sharp, unmistakable metallic tang of fear. The noise was a physical weight. 100 dogs barking, throwing themselves against aluminum gates, begging for a glance from anyone walking past. Dean stood at the front desk. The attendant, a tired guy whose name tag read Albert, looked up from a clipboard. "Looking for a family pet?" Albert asked, taking in Dean's heavy jacket, his permanent scowl, the slight stiffness in his right shoulder where the vest hadn't completely caught the impact. "No," Dean said. "I want the one nobody else wants. The dead end." Albert stopped writing. He looked at Dean for a long moment, assessing him. "You a cop?" "On leave," Albert sighed, pulling a ring of brass keys from his belt. "Don't say I didn't warn you. Back this way." They walked past the main adoption floor, past the eager golden retriever mixes, the trembling pit bulls huddled in the corners, the terriers spinning in anxious circles. They walked through a set of heavy steel double doors that slammed shut behind them, cutting off the frantic chorus of the main floor. The hallway here was narrow. The lights buzzed. A low, erratic fluorescent hum. "Isolation ward," Albert said, his voice echoing off the damp green tiles. "We keep the court holds here, the biters, the ones running out of time." He stopped in front of the very last run. Cell 42. Before Dean could even look through the wire, the fence exploded. A massive shape hit the chain link with the force of a battering ram. The heavy gauge wire rattled violently in its frame. Snapping jaws cracked against the metal, a terrifying, percussive sound. Albert took a quick step backward, instinct overriding experience. Dean didn't move. He stood a foot from the fence and looked at the animal. It was a German shepherd, or at least it used to be. He weighed easily 100 pounds, his coat a patchy mess of black and tan. Half of his left ear was torn away. A thick pink scar cut across the bridge of his snout, pulling his lip up into a permanent, sneering snarl. He hit the fence again, saliva flying from his jaws. His dark eyes wide and rimmed with white panic. He didn't bark. He just threw his body against the barrier, desperate to destroy whatever was on the other side. "County brought him in 3 weeks ago," Albert shouted over the noise of the rattling cage. "Ex-police K9 washout. They say a private contractor tried to train him, used a heavy hand, broke the dog's nerve. He bit the trainer, got sold to a security firm, bit a guard, ended up wandering the rail yards. Animal control took 3 darts to bring him down. He's aggressive, unpredictable, and completely feral at this point." "When's his time up?" Dean asked, his voice flat. Friday morning. He's scheduled for the needle. We can't even clean his run without a catch-pole. You don't want this dog, officer. He's a loaded gun with a filed-down sear. Dean looked at the shepherd. The dog had stopped throwing himself at the fence and was now pacing. 3 tight, frantic steps to the left, 3 steps to the right, a relentless, neurotic pendulum. His heavy breathing rasped in the quiet hallway. Dean slowly unzipped his jacket. He dropped it on the damp concrete floor. Open the secondary door, Dean said. You're out of your mind. Open the door, Albert. Leave the inner gate locked. Just let me in the vestibule. Albert shook his head, muttering under his breath, but he slid the key into the lock. The heavy outer door swung open. Dean stepped into the small 3x3 concrete space separating the hallway from the dog's actual pen. He pushed the door shut behind him. The shepherd lunged again, slamming his paws against the inner gate. His teeth caught the wire, metal grating against enamel. Dean didn't raise a hand. He didn't speak a soothing word. He simply turned his back to the raging animal, slid down the concrete wall, and sat on the floor. He crossed his legs, rested his hands on his knees, and stared blankly at the drain in the center of the tiles. He let the dog rage. For 10 minutes the shepherd snarled, paced, and snapped at the air behind Dean's head. Dean focused on his own breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The same tactical breathing he used when his heart rate spiked in the field. He offered the dog nothing. No eye contact to challenge him, no fear to trigger his prey drive, no soft words to confuse him, just a solid, unmovable presence. Slowly, the pacing slowed. The heavy, ragged panting deepened. Dean heard the click of claws on concrete, then silence. He didn't turn around. He just waited. After another minute, he felt a hot, damp puff of air against the back of his neck. The dog was sniffing his collar, sniffing the lingering scent of gun oil, stale coffee, and the cold sweat of a man who hadn't slept a full night in 6 months. Dean turned his head just an inch. The shepherd was sitting on the other side of the wire. His ears were pinned back, his body coiled tight like a spring. But the manic violence was gone from his eyes, replaced, for just a second, by an overwhelming, crushing exhaustion. Dean knew that look. He saw it in the bathroom mirror every morning. "Get the paperwork," Dean called out to Albert without looking away from the dog. "I'm taking him home." The county made Dean sign 3 separate liability waivers. One explicitly stated that the shelter was not responsible for any disfigurement, dismemberment, or death caused by the animal. The file Albert handed over was thick, stamped with a heavy red euthanize on the top tab. Dean peeled the sticker off, crumpled it into a ball, and dropped it in the trash. He named the dog Dutch. Getting Dutch out of the isolation ward took 45 minutes. When Albert approached with the rigid aluminum catchpole, Dutch backed into the corner of his concrete cell, baring his teeth, ready to fight to the death. Dean pushed the pole away. He took a heavy leather slip lid from his pocket. He walked into the cell, ignoring the low, guttural growl vibrating in Dutch's chest. Dean simply stood there, holding the loop open. He didn't force it. He didn't move. He let the silence stretch until the tension in the room grew brittle. Finally, driven by some buried instinct or simply too tired to fight another human, Dutch lowered his heavy head. Dean slipped the leather over the scarred neck. The dog flinched, closing his eyes tight, anticipating a blow. Dean just turned and walked out. Dutch followed, His head hung low, his tail tucked tight between his hind legs. The drive to Dean's house was entirely silent. Dean lived at the end of a heavily wooded dirt road, 20 miles outside the city limits. It was a secluded, single-story cabin he had bought with his partner years ago, back when they had plans to fix it up. Now it was just a quiet place to hide. When Dean opened the tailgate of the Tahoe, Dutch didn't jump out. He lay flat against the carpeted floor, staring past Dean at the dark line of pine trees. Dean left the tailgate open, walked up to the porch, and sat on the steps. It took 2 hours before Dutch finally crept out of the truck, his belly nearly scraping the dirt, sniffing the damp earth. The first week was a masterclass in misery. There was no magical bond, no cinematic moment of connection where man and beast understood each other. Dutch was a profoundly broken animal, and he treated the cabin like a hostile environment. He refused to sleep in the open. Instead, he wedged his massive frame behind the water heater in the utility closet, a dark, cramped space where he felt secure. He wouldn't eat dog food. Dean poured expensive kibble into a metal bowl, and Dutch ignored it. On the third day, Dean drove to the local butcher, bought 3 pounds of raw, cheap ground beef, and slapped it onto a paper plate. He slid the plate across the linoleum floor toward the utility closet, then walked into the living room and turned on the television. He didn't watch to see if the dog ate. When he returned an hour later, the plate was spotless. The tension in the house was constant. It was like living with a live grenade on the coffee table. Every time Dean moved too fast, stood up too suddenly, or dropped a spoon in the sink, Dutch would flinch, scrambling backward, his hackles raised and a low rumble starting in his throat. On day 5, a delivery driver dropped a package loudly onto the wooden front porch. Dutch panicked. He was in the hallway when the heavy thud echoed through the quiet house. Instinct took over. He spun around, desperate to escape the perceived threat, and crashed into the closed bathroom door. Terrified, the dog began to bite and tear at the wooden door frame, splintering the trim, his heavy claws gouging deep scratches into the drywall. Dean came out of the kitchen. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his hands. He just stood still at the end of the hall. Dutch froze. He looked at the ruined door frame, then at Dean. The dog was panting heavily, a small trickle of blood on his gums where a splinter of wood had caught him. He braced himself, eyes wide, waiting for the screaming, the kicking, the heavy hand of a trainer correcting him for destroying property. Dean looked at the torn wood. He looked at the dog. Without a word, Dean went to the closet and pulled out a broom and a dustpan. He knelt on the floor, 3 feet from the trembling 100-pound shepherd, and began sweeping up the splinters. Dutch watched him, entirely still, his brain short-circuiting at the lack of violence. When the floor was clean, Dean went to the bathroom cabinet and pulled out a clean towel and a bottle of saline. He sat cross-legged on the floor. "Come here," Dean said. It was the first time he had spoken directly to the dog in days. His voice was gravelly, quiet. Dutch hesitated. He took 1 step forward, then another. He stretched his long neck out, sniffing the towel. Dean slowly raised his hand, telegraphing the movement so there were no surprises. He gently pressed the damp towel against Dutch's bloody gum line. The dog flinched, but didn't pull away. Dean wiped away the blood, his rough fingers briefly brushing against the coarse fur of Dutch's unscarred cheek. "It's just wood," Dean muttered, dropping his hand. "Don't worry about it." The real shift happened 3 nights later, A severe spring thunderstorm rolled over the tree line. Thunder cracked like artillery fire directly above the cabin. Lightning strobed violently through the blinds. In his bedroom, Dean was trapped in the past. He was back in the warehouse. The air smelled of cordite and wet concrete. He heard the sharp, terrifying crack of an AK-47, the shattering of glass, his own voice screaming into the radio. Dean woke up choking on dead air. He threw himself sideways, tangling his legs in the sheets, reaching frantically for a service weapon that was locked in a safe down the hall. He hit the hardwood floor hard, tearing the blankets down with him. He scrambled backward until his shoulders hit the wall, his chest heaving, sweat stinging his eyes, completely lost in the dark. A flash of lightning illuminated the doorway. A massive silhouette stood there. Dean's breath caught in his throat. Dutch stood completely still, his ears pivoted forward. In the dark, a large, terrified man thrashing on the floor was exactly the kind of chaotic trigger that made aggressive dogs attack. Dutch walked slowly into the room. His steps were deliberate, stiff-legged. He approached the corner where Dean sat trembling. Dean braced himself. He couldn't fight off a 100-pound K9 right now. He didn't have the strength. Dutch stopped inches from Dean's face. The dog lowered his heavy, scarred head. He didn't bare his teeth. He didn't growl. Instead, he bumped his wet, cold nose roughly against Dean's bare knee. Once, a clumsy, awkward gesture. Then Dutch turned around. He let out a long, heavy sigh, circled twice, and laid his massive body down on the floor right in front of Dean. He put his back to the man, facing the open bedroom door, his dark eyes fixed on the empty hallway. Watching, guarding. Dean rested his head against the drywall, the rapid drumming of his heart finally beginning to slow. He reached out, his hand shaking slightly, and rested his palm on the thick fur of Dutch's back. The dog didn't flinch. They weren't fixing each other. They were just surviving the dark together, but the quiet wouldn't last. 2 weeks later, the isolation of the cabin was broken. It started just past midnight. Not a crack of thunder, but the distinct heavy crunch of tires rolling slowly over the gravel at the end of the driveway. Dutch's head snapped up from the floor, his ears pinned forward. And for the first time since Dean brought him home, the dog let out a low, vibrating growl that held no fear. It was pure, lethal purpose. Dean didn't move immediately. He lay perfectly still on the hardwood floor, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. Outside, a car engine idled high and rough, then shut off. 2 heavy doors opened and closed with quiet, deliberate clicks. Someone was trying to be stealthy, but the heavy boots crunching on the wet gravel gave them away. Dean rolled onto his stomach. He ignored the dull ache in his bad shoulder and pushed himself up. He moved silently to the bedroom closet, dropping to one knee. He punched a 4-digit code into the small steel lockbox bolted to the floorboards. The keypad glowed a faint, sterile green. The heavy latch clicked open. Dean pulled out his service Glock 19, racked the slide, and thumbed the safety off. The metallic clack was deafening in the quiet house. Dutch didn't flinch at the sound of the weapon. Instead, the dog moved to the bedroom doorway and stopped. He didn't bark. He didn't pace. He planted his front paws square on the threshold, lowering his massive head. His muscles coiled so tightly they vibrated. The feral, frantic energy from the shelter was entirely gone. A feral dog barks to warn predators away. A trained police K9 stays silent, waiting for the breach. Dean watched the dog's silhouette in the gloom, a sudden realization cutting through the adrenaline in his veins. He isn't broken, Dean thought. He was just waiting for the war to start. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden planks of the front porch. A flashlight beam cut a sharp, erratic path through the gaps in the living room blinds. Dean moved down the hallway, pressing his back against the peeling wallpaper. He could hear voices now. Low, muffled whispers on the other side of the heavy oak front door. Just kick it. The guy's a washed-up cop, probably passed out drunk. It wasn't a professional hit. It was desperate, violent opportunity. Tweakers looking for unsecured firearms, cash, or prescription pills. Bold enough to target an isolated cabin miles from county patrol routes. A heavy metal tool, a crowbar, or a heavy flathead screwdriver scraped against the brass deadbolt. The lock groaned. "I got it," a rough voice muttered. "Just hit it." The front door exploded inward. Splinters of the door frame showered the living room rug. Two men shoved their way into the cabin. The first man was tall, entirely strung out, sweeping the room with a sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun. The second trailed behind, holding a heavy iron tire iron. "Nobody move!" the tall man screamed, his voice cracking with chemical panic. He swung the barrel of the shotgun toward the dark hallway. Dean raised his Glock, centering the tritium sights on the man's chest. But before his finger could begin the trigger pull, a shadow detached itself from the bedroom doorframe. Dutch didn't run. He launched. 100 pounds of bone, muscle, and teeth closed the distance of the hallway in a single second. The dog didn't make a sound until he made impact. It was a terrifying, guttural roar as Dutch hit the tall man square in the center of his chest. The kinetic force of the strike lifted the intruder off his feet. The shotgun discharged violently into the ceiling, raining drywall dust and yellow insulation down onto the floorboards. Dutch didn't bite blindly. The frantic, snapping shelter dog was gone. Instinct and thousands of hours of suppressed training overrode the trauma. Dutch locked his jaws onto the man's right forearm, crushing the wrist against the shotgun stock, pinning the weapon down. He drove the man backwards, slamming him onto the coffee table. Wood splintered. Glass shattered. The man screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure agony. The second intruder froze, his eyes wide, staring at the monster tearing his partner apart. He raised the tire iron, stepping forward to brain the dog from behind. "Drop it!" Dean roared, stepping out of the shadows, the flashlight on his pistol blinding the second man. "Drop the iron, or I put you through the wall." The man looked at the light, looked at the black muzzle of the Glock, and dropped the heavy iron. It clattered loudly against the hard wood. He threw his hands up, backing away until his spine hit the front door. On the floor, the first man was thrashing wildly, trying to punch Dutch in the ribs with his free hand. Dutch ignored the blows. He simply clamped his jaws tighter, giving a vicious, brutal shake of his head. Blood spattered the torn rug. The man dropped the shotgun, wailing. "Call him off! Man, call the dog off!" the second intruder begged, sliding down the wall. Dean kept his weapon trained on the man against the wall. He looked at the chaos on the floor. He didn't know the dog's previous commands. He didn't know the language the contractor had used. Dean took a breath, lowering his voice to a sharp, authoritative bark. "Dutch aus!" For a terrible, stretched second, nothing happened. The man on the floor sobbed. Then Dutch stopped shaking his head. He opened his bloody jaws, releasing the man's mangled arm. The dog stepped back. He didn't retreat. He sat rigidly, inches from the man's face, his chest heaving, saliva and blood dripping from his chin. His ears were pinned forward, his dark eyes locked on the target. He was waiting for the next command. Dean pulled his phone from his pocket with his left hand and dialed dispatch. It took 25 minutes for the county sheriff's deputies to navigate the dirt roads. By the time the heavy rhythmic flash of blue and red strobes painted the trees outside, the cabin was dead silent. The man with the torn arm had passed out from the pain and blood loss. The second man was sitting on the floor, his hands zip-tied behind his back, staring terrified at the massive German shepherd sitting perfectly still in the center of the room. Heavy boots pounded onto the porch. Flashlights cut through the open doorway. "Sheriff's Department, hands where I can see them." "It's Hatcher," Dean called out from the kitchen counter. He had placed his Glock on the table and was drinking a glass of tap water. "Scene is secure." Sergeant Brody, a 20-year veteran with a graying mustache and a thick build, stepped over the ruined threshold. Two deputies filed in behind him, sweeping the corners. Brody lowered his weapon when he saw Dean, but his eyes immediately locked onto the dog. Dutch hadn't moved. He remained in his rigid sit, his eyes tracking the deputies. He didn't growl at the uniforms. He understood what they were. "Jesus, Dean," Brody muttered, holstering his weapon. He looked at the shotgun on the floor, the bloody coffee table, and the unconscious man. "Dispatch said you had an intruder. Looks like you handled it." Brody gestured toward the massive shepherd. "Is that the washout from animal control? Albert told me you lost your damn mind and adopted the feral case." "He's not feral," Dean said quietly. He set his glass down. Brody walked closer, studying the dog. Dutch's scarred snout was covered in drying blood. "He tore that kid's arm to shreds. I'm surprised he didn't go for the throat. You're lucky he didn't turn on you in the dark." "He wasn't fighting," Dean said. He walked over to the center of the room. "He was working." Dean stopped right beside Dutch. The dog looked up at him, a silent check-in. Dean reached down, his fingers brushing the coarse fur behind Dutch's torn ear. The dog leaned his heavy weight against Dean's leg. The brutal tension in his muscles finally melted away. Brody watched the interaction, shaking his head in disbelief. "Albert said they had to use a catch pole just to feed him. They were treating him like a monster," Dean said, looking down at the dog. "You treat something like a monster long enough, it's going to believe you." The paramedics arrived minutes later. When they brought the stretcher in to load the unconscious intruder, Dutch let out a low, warning rumble. Dean just snapped his fingers once. The dog went silent, retreating to sit by Dean's left side. Perfect heel position. It took 3 hours to clear the scene. Statements were taken, evidence was bagged, and the shattered front door was boarded up with heavy plywood. By the time the last squad car crunched its way down the gravel drive, the sky over the tree line was bleeding a bruised, pale purple. Morning. The cabin smelled of copper, sweat, and sawdust. Dean locked the deadbolt on the temporary plywood door. He walked into the kitchen, his boots sticking slightly to the floorboards. He filled a metal bowl with fresh water and placed it in the corner. Then he filled another bowl with high-grade kibble and set it down. He didn't walk away this time. He just stood there. Dutch walked into the kitchen. The dog sniffed the water, took a long, loud drink, and then turned to the bowl of dry food. He ate, slowly, methodically, without looking over his shoulder. Dean watched him. For the first time in 6 months, the ringing in his ears was entirely gone. The phantom weight on his chest, the crushing, breathless panic that followed him into every dark room, had evaporated. He walked into the living room and slumped down onto the intact sofa. Every muscle in his body ached. His bad shoulder throbbed with a dull, rhythmic heat. He was exhausted, but it was a clean exhaustion. The kind you earn after a long shift, not the kind that hollows you out from the inside. He heard the click of claws on the linoleum. Dutch walked into the living room. The dog stopped at the edge of the rug, looking at the boarded-up door, then at the shattered coffee table. Finally, he looked at Dean. Dutch walked over to the sofa. He didn't hesitate. He climbed up, his heavy paws pressing into the cushions, and circled twice. He dropped his massive body down, right next to Dean. He rested his scarred, heavy head entirely on Dean's thigh, letting out a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to empty his lungs completely. Dean rested his hand on the dog's back, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of his ribs. They weren't fixed. Dean would still wake up sweating on some nights. Dutch would still cower when a truck backfired on the highway. The scars on the dog's face would never fade, and the bullet fragments in Dean's shoulder would always ache when it rained. They were both still jagged edges and blown-out nerves. But as the morning sun finally broke through the blinds, painting the ruined living room in a harsh, unforgiving light, Dean closed his eyes and actually slept. He finally had his anchor, and Dutch finally had his home. If this story about resilience, trust, and second chances moved you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deeply emotional stories about the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. We want to hear from you. Have you ever rescued an animal that ended up rescuing you right back? Drop your experiences in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going.